you might want to do is replace your CakePHP views and templates with a React application. So this video is going to show how to embed a Cake PHP template with React and make requests back to Cake in the back end. And also, if we have a look here, we've got the Create React App development application running as well, with the ability to make the API calls back to the Cake backend. So we're just going to go through that process step by step. To start, I'm starting with a bare Cake PHP instance, and so we're just going to go, it's called Embed React in Cake, and get VS Code running. Say yes to trust. Now, in Cake PHP, we have something known as a component, and a component is reusable code that you can share amongst all your controllers, and it's a great place to package logic that you might want to use elsewhere while getting access to the controller as well. So to start, we're going to create a new component, and we're going to call it the ReactEmbed Component. So bin cake bake component React embed. And as you can see that it adds it to this directory here, and it's got no other code other than it's just a skeleton. Now we want to create a controller, and with baking controllers you have a heap of options, and so we're going to choose the no actions, and we're going to choose to include a component in the baked controller there. So I'm going to say no actions, and then I'm going to say components with an S, React Embed, and we're going to call this controller the React controller. And as you can see, we now have a controller with it loading that embed component in the initialize method with no actions. Now, next step is to create a public function, which is our action, and we're going to call that embed, because that's what we're doing. We're embedding a React component. And once we've done that, let's start our Cake PHP server. And before we do that, I just need to, that would error out because I've got some other things running in the background there. So we'll just close those down so it doesn't cause an error. And start our Cake server, and then just have a look at what we've got. So this is the default home page that Cake has when you first install. And we're not going to connect a database because this is sort of not going to focus on anything to do with the database backend. But now that that's started, we now need to say, okay, we've got a React controller and an embed action. So that is located here. And as you can see, it's saying missing template. So we can go into our templates folder. Now the convention is it's pages controller, there'll be a pages directory. So for the React controller, we'll want a React directory, and the file matches the name of the action. Now if your action was, say for example, if your action was, let's say you put another action in and you went public function load API, and you wanted to create a template for that, then the new template would be load API PHP in this with the separated, lowercase separated by that sort of stuff. So that's just another thought there. All right, so now we've got our embed action with the template, and it's always nice to avoid these sorts of error messages. So what we're going to do, we're going to open up our roots file under the config folder. So there it is there, and we're going to, let's enlarge this so we can see it a bit better. We're going to go into our roots here, and we're going to change our default root, which is the base root, to embed. We don't need home. And then we want to also, because normally when you specify just the controller, it would look for the index action, but that doesn't exist. So we'll make those changes there. So now we have, and if we try React and finally embed, and it all points to the same location really. So we're ready to start embedding a component. So with create React App, we take the React App installation command, we go back to VS Code, and I don't know, you might want to put it anywhere else, but I sort of like to put things in the SRC folder because that's where all the source is, and I'll give it a name. So my app will be called React App, and we'll just let that install for the time being. Now that take a few moments. So now let's start to look at, we'll just close these other folders down. Let's start making progress on our component. Now the component, as we mentioned, is going to be able to be shared by other controllers, and we're going to put the logic in here. So public function to return the assets that we need to, and set them in the view, the assets we need to load the React app. Now we notice down the bottom here that our React app has finished installing. So we go npm run start, and that's your typical development environment. Let's just refresh that so it is no longer looking at the old code, the end result. But this is the bare bones of your React app, and it basically, from the default, it will be like this. Now we need to, let's open up another terminal and go into our React app. When we saw in the other terminal, it said to create a production build, use npm run build. So let's do that. First of all, we'll take note of the folders that are in our React app, and then we'll run the build. And we run the build and then have a look what's in there, and we see it's created a build folder with a whole heap of assets packaged up ready for deployment. Now in CakePHP, your web directory, everything's served out of the webroot folder. So what we want to do is run the build and then copy across that build folder into the webroot so it's available to CakePHP to serve. So to do that, we open up our package.json, and we scroll down to our scripts property, and we're going to make a change to our build command. Now the first thing we need to do, so we're in a command line, we're down inside our Create React App folder, and the first thing we want to do, whenever we run a build, after the build step, we want to just from our webroot folder, we just want to never works the way you want, so I'll type it in. So we want to firstly clear whatever was there in the first place, and then we want to copy the build folder and to the same location, so webroot, and then we want to rename the build folder to React App. So let's run that again. So run build, and then we have a look in our webroot and we find that our React App is deployed into the webroot folder. Now that is where we want to pick up the details of how to embed this application into CakePHP. So if we click on we're in webroot React App, we click on asset-manifest.json, we can see that there's a whole bunch of files listed, but we're really only interested in the entry points because this CSS entry point will lead to all the other CSS that's bundled up, and this JavaScript entry point will lead to all the JavaScript. Now, one thing I'm doing, I don't know if these entry points, if there's multiple ones of these, so you'd have to modify it, but I'm making the assumption that there's just always two, a CSS and a JS, when I write my embed React Embed component. So just so that I can refer to that later, I'm just going to go cat webroot React App asset and just pipe it through JQ so it'll be nice and colored, and we're going to look at that as we write our code. So the first thing we want to do when we go to embed React into is get a hold of this asset manifest file. Now within CakePHP, if we go to our standard CakePHP development environment, we see that under the environment panel we have a whole heap of constants defined, and the one we're interested in is the www_root constant, and the other one is the directory separator one, so DS. So just take note of that, and that it's also got a trailing slash because that's important. So we want to say to ourselves, okay, I'm going to use a CakePHP constant, and what I'm going to do is get a reference to where this file is located. So in the controller, we need to say, okay, so we're going to call the React Embed component, we're going to call the assets method, and we're going to pass to it the name of the folder in our webroot. And then we're going to say, okay, I've got to take that folder name, and then I'm going to say, okay, that folder name with the directory separator, and then the name of the file, asset-manifest.json. Want to do some error checking as well. File underscore exists, file, if it doesn't exist, just throw a new, you could use not found exception. You could say could not find asset manifest in app name. And if we do find the file, we want to get the contents. So we want to file get contents and pass it the file, and then we want to return to ourselves a what are we doing? JSON decode, and we want to pass in the contents. So what is that going to do? Well, let's have a look. Let's use dump and die, and just enter it. And so we're returning an entry points, an object with the entry points property there. So now we want to go into the next step, which we want to say, okay, I want to grab those JS and CSS assets. Now we can do this a lot of different ways, but let's use some of Cake's built-in methods, which are really handy. So we want entry points. So create a collection out of those entry points, then call the reduce method on it. And we want the accumulated value, and each value as we go through, it's going to be an entry point. And then we want to return. What we're looking for is we're looking for the CSS value and the JS value, and we want to separate them into an array. So I'm going to say, okay, grab the extension, and the extension is, we're going to use path info. We're going to pass it the entry point string, and then we're going to say path info, and the constant we want is the extension. So we now go return that. I'm going to merge, and it's the token, it's keyed on the token, which is the, sorry, not token, the extension. And we need to provide a full path from the web, relative from the webroot to this. So what that's going to be is we want a directory separator. So it starts with a /. Then we actually need to pass in the app name. So to do that, we need to put a use statement here and type in app name. And then we need to put in another directory separator, because we notice that these don't have a leading /. And then we want to just say entry point. So we want to merge that with whatever's already in the array and return it. And we can got a squiggly line there because we need to also specify the initial value, which is going to be an empty array. And now let's have a look at that. What do we get from running that reduce function? Go back to our, and we get a JavaScript and a CSS keyed entry point. So once we've done that, we now want to set those variables to a controller. Now, as we mentioned, that the component is something that you can embed into a controller. So there's a method which you can use to get a reference to the controller called the getController method. And then you can say, okay, same methods you'd use in a controller, a set method, and we can just set those assets to the controller. So the assets, JavaScript, CSS, just reload it, and then have a look at actually, we want to go down here, go to our variables, and we can see that in our view, we've now got access to those two values. So now we need to tell our CakePHP view about those two separate things. We need to say, okay, I've got a CSS script that I'd like you to load in. And what I want you to do is I want you to put that in the default block. Now the default block, I'll show you that in a moment. And we've got the same thing for script, and we put the JS in there as well. So when we reload and we have a look at our code, the default block, so you can see the other style sheets are here in the head of the document, and it's just appended our asset to the default CSS script block, and the default script block is just before the closing head tag as well. So if we want to, we can check to see if we're right by opening that, and we'll see that we've got our references correct by just opening it in a new tab, and you can see the code there. So how do we now embed in our page the React app? Well, if we have a look at the index.js of our React app, we can see that when this code loads, it looks in the current document for an element with an ID of root, and then it will load itself or render itself inside that root element. So let's create that root element. So we'll create a div tag with an ID of root, and let's see what happens when we load. Now, you might be expecting to see your React component, but if we have a look, we can see that there's been an error. Now, why is that happening? Well, when we have a look at the code, this script loads and then it immediately looks for this root element. But because it's loading before the root element, it says I can't find it and it throws an error. So what we need to do is move the script tag that's loading the JavaScript entry point down to below the root element. So we're going to put it down here just before the closing body tag. So how do we do that? We go to our templates folder, into layout, and we choose the default layout. And at the bottom of the page, we can see this is our default script block here, and that's where it is currently. But let's copy that down to here, and then give it an arbitrary name, anything you like, and we're going to call it React. And then go back to your template and just type in React. And then from that point on, when you reload, it's now loading in the right order. But now we see another error. And we see that the logo is doing a lap, but it's not actually being seen. Now, if we look at our network tab, scroll, and then just look for the red, we will see that when we look at the request header, that the logo, which is from inside the React -app folder, it's not requesting it from there, it's actually looking for it in the wrong spot. So what we need to do is now tell our React build environment in package.json, we go into at a home page variable, and we just say React app. So we know now when we do, let's do a build. So we go npm run build. And we reload it, and now we see that it's now finding it in the right place. And then as we look at the logo, we can see that the path to it is now correct. So we're getting there with regard to getting React running on CakePHP. Now, what's the next step? Let's close our windows now. What we pretty much always want to do, we want to be able to develop our React app in the Create React development environment, which gives us hot reloading and everything. And then we want to be able to make requests in local development mode and when it's embedded in Cake back to the Cake backend. So let's now configure that. Open the index.js file in your React app and notice that it's looking for an element in the page called the root element. So what we're going to do, we're just going to configure const root element. So we're going to take that out of that create root method there, and we're going to get a reference to that, and then we're going to say, okay, when I'm in development mode, I want to be able to, so we're going to create, I want to call something in the back end, and this could be whatever you want it to be, but I'm going to create another method in my React controller that will return some dummy data. But in the React app, I'm going to say for local development, I want it to talk back to that URL. But if process.env.node_env, now there's two things that will come back from this. It'll either be development or production. So what I'm going to say, if it's the production app, then I want you to change the URL to be a get attribute to be a reference to whatever I put in the root element to that attribute. So how does that work? Now I'm going to avoid an error that I always create with this. Just remember that once you've taken this reference, you need to add it back to the create root statement there. So embed, go back to our embed. Now here we're saying, in the code here, we're saying get an attribute on that root element of data URL. So let's add that. So we go data URL, and we're going to use one of Cake's inbuilt components, the router. It's not a component, but it's a utility class. And we're going to say, okay, I just want you to build me a URL that will return a URL to this API class. Now, if you want to, you can be more specific and say, okay, it's the React controller and the API action there. So let's have a look at that when we load our look at our element there, and you can see now that in that embed template we now are saying to our React root element we've attached a URL which we can call back to. And this there's always different options, but if you needed to, you could say, okay, I want to change this to be a full base URL and do those sorts of things, but we don't need it for our particular needs. So we now are passing to our built React app a data URL so that it can talk back, and if we're not in production mode, we're going to talk directly to that back end. So let's make a dummy thing that'll return some information for us. So we'll just change this. We'll just public function, let's call it API, and we're going to just create YouTube embed React in CakePHP for tutorial. Now that is just some information we want to pass to our React app. So how do we prepare that to be sent to our React app? Well, as normal with normal views, we want to set the data to the view. But in this case, we want this to be sent to our React client as JSON data. So we get a reference to the view builder, and we set an option to serialize. So if any client asks for this information and they say, I'm expecting JSON, please wrap that in, use JSON encode and send it back to the client as JSON, please. So that is doing exactly what it should do there. Now if we now go to the API, when it's a standard web request, and it will look in the template directory for a template named API and then try to render it and send it back to the default client. This is not necessary, but I'm going to show it anyway because I think it's kind of cool that you really can do a lot with CakePHP requests. So you can do some logic and say, look, if this request is an ajax request, do something, or if it's not an ajax request, do something. So what I'm going to do here is say, okay, it's not an ajax request that I'm making using a browser because it's not requesting JSON. So when you do that, get the response and then send back a string body and put it in. Send back JSON encoded the data and do it with JSON pretty print, and then right. So it's going to look into the request and say, is it a ajax request or not, and then return this if it's not. So what does that mean? Well, it means that I can explicitly say, look, for a non-ajax request, still send something back, but do something different. And that's a really powerful thing, especially if you're leveraging Cake's default baked actions, and you maybe want to do something if it's an ajax request, but something else if it's a normal web request. So that is a really good way of starting to take control of your granular control of your requests by using this ability to look at requests. If you click on this and go to the method, ServerRequest method, notice that the way it's identifying an ajax request is if there's a HTTP header X requested with, and if the value is XML HTTP request. So you can look at all the detector methods here and say, oh, look, I've got one that would check for SSL. Maybe you want to do something or deny only certain methods and those sorts of things. You've got all these abilities, and you can add your own custom detectors as well, but it's just really handy to know that. All right, so we're still at the point where we've said we can talk to a different URL if it's production or it's development, but does it work? Well, let's go have a look at our React app at the moment. And I'm just going to open up the developer tools, and Right, everything's still working at the moment. So let's go and close everything but this index. Close all that. Oh, closed all, doesn't matter. Let's go in here and now make a web request. Okay, so we've got this URL. We need to tell the component about it. So we go URL equals URL. So we're passing that into the component. Now we need to handle that. We could say prop and then, use that as well, but we can just use destructuring here. So we want to take that URL. We want to, when the component loads, we want to do something. We're going to make a fetch request to that URL. And as we mentioned, if we have a look at our React controller again, the way it's identifying that this is an Ajax request, we said that it's X requested with, get that up again. So we look for Ajax. So it's looking for this. So we need to add that into our request so that it knows what sort of request it is, so we can specify that. Let's go. Now it's actually, I don't know why, but requested with is different. Okay. And so we want to do that, and we want to say, okay, this particular request has a content type. If we're going to post things back especially, we'd want to specify this as well. And the encoding we want to accept, is application JSON. So we want to make a request to our URL. We want to pass these headers. When we make it, it's going to be a GET request. And then we want to take the response and return JSON there. And maybe we can format the document and format that. And then from that, we're going to receive some data. And the data, what we want to do with it, we want to set it to some state, which we haven't created yet, but let's do that there. So we need to do a const data, set data, and use state. And we want to make it an empty array if it's not got anything in it. So let's have a look at our query there, and it's blown up. So we've made a request, but it's saying, if we have a look at our console, it's saying that I am not going to accept this request because of cross-origin restrictions. So it's saying that it's trying to request from our URL here to here, and it's being rejected. So let's make this able to make a request from our React app development environment across to Cake. Now to do that, we're going to install some middleware into Cake. And this is Core's middleware. It was written a couple of years ago by this GitHub account, but I've had to modify it because it's been changes to the default exceptions and those sorts of things for the later version. So I'm just going to grab all of this and open up our composer JSON, paste it in, and it's just going to be not happy because there's a lot of stuff that I shouldn't have copied. Put it into our require here and give it a, let's format that so it's a bit more, can we do that? Yep, that's better. All right, so we've got, instead of pulling it from the default repository, I've created an updated version on my GitHub. So it's now going to look for this, match it with this, and pull it from here instead of where it normally comes from. So we'll get a terminal in the root there, and we go composer, update. So update will look through all the dependencies and see if there's anything new that it needs to pull in, and it finds it. And then it will install that into the vendor directory. Now this is a plugin, and plugins require loading. So here we have a SRC application, so we need to go bin cake plugin load, and we need to specify, and the name of this plugin is cause plugin, and there we see it now entered into that SRC application, so it's going to load it. Now we've done that. Now we need to specify some configuration. So going to app local and make sure that's correct, and grab the configuration here, put it in. Now this is a bad idea, so let's change that. So we know that the origin that we want to approve, so when Cake sees an origin of localhost 3000, we want to say yes, it's okay. We want to allow those methods, and we might just change this as well to, so we've got web exception renderer, and it's just a bit neater than specifying the full class, but you've got to pull in at the top. So now let's have a look at our React app and see what happens. So you can see the error message is now gone, but we've got another huge problem here. See, it's just doing thousands of requests, so we need to fix that. So when we pass in this dependency, we need to put in a dependency array here, and what this will do for useEffect, it will say, I'll only rerun this if this dependency changes. So let's go back and see what we've now got. So now we have, oddly enough, we've reloaded it once, but it's done the get request twice. And that's a new feature of React 18. So let's just make a change to make sure it only does one request and it cancels the first one. So we're going to go const controller new abort controller, and then we're going to need a signal. So signal equals controller dot signal, and we're going to pass that in to our fetch configuration object, and then we're going to tell useEffect that when you unmount, do a cleanup function, and the cleanup function is going to just call abort. So when you unmount, just abort whatever requests running or whatever things being run, and then when you remount, well, this won't abort again. So let's reload, and then we see, okay, so the React component unmounted, cancelled the, as you see there, it says cancelled, and then it made a response here. Now let's have a look at the request headers. So we specified a X requested with header, and we've specified content type, and we said we're going to accept JSON, which means Cake knows what to respond with. So looking at the shape of that state, I'm only interested in the array, so I might go back into the code as well and just go in one step into that data property and set that instead. So let's just make a little bit of a change here to remove some of this code and just have the rotating logo. And maybe we'll just reduce the size of the logo and give ourselves a smaller height. Yeah, that's better. And now we'll do a typical React sort of code, and I'm gonna just render to the screen a couple of paragraphs with each one of the lines we passed from our Cake API endpoint, and we should now have that in our local development environment. Now, when we look at this in Cake, we now need to go back to here and run a build. And when we reload, we can see that now we've got our React app calling an API both in production and development mode, and it's working successfully and avoiding cause errors and those sorts of things. And with just one thing that I like to do, every time I did a build, it didn't increment the version, and I was thinking, how do we do that? But there is a way to automate versioning as well. So what I do is I create a npm version patch, and then I say npm run build. And so when I call this, I can just go build version, and you can see that the version has already incremented to 1, 2. It will just patch it for you, and you know which version you're loading and that sort of stuff. So that is how to embed a React app and create React app into CakePHP and enable some of the features that you need to successfully develop a React app embedded in Cake.